Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey into a topic that, well, it might feel familiar, but as we'll discover, it's far more intricate and surprising than the narratives we often hear. We're taking a deep dive into the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, and what's truly compelling about our sources is how they reveal this isn't just about a single event or, a simple triumphant story. It's a long, fractured, and deeply contested process. American independence wasn't a clean break,
Right.
nor was it universally celebrated. It was really a collision of competing ideas, a struggle for land, and a crucible for diverse, even contradictory American identities.
That's a crucial distinction. Instead of thinking of it as just the spirit of 76, our mission today is to uncover the many spirits of 76. Those multiple, overlapping, and often conflicting revolutions that kind of converged in that sweltering Philadelphia summer of 1776. To truly understand the roots of the American Revolution, we need to rewind a bit. It wasn't just a sudden spark in 1776, was it?
No, not at all.
It really seems to begin with a global conflict that fundamentally reshaped the British Empire, starting way back, maybe 1754.
That's right. We're talking about the 7 Years' War, known over here as the French and Indian War. And while it was fought worldwide, its American origins were firmly rooted in the desire for the Ohio River Valley.
Ah, the Ohio Valley.
Yeah, huge prize. Immense interest from British land speculators, ambitious settlers,
Yeah.
including, a young George Washington.
And Britain's victory in 1763, where France basically ceded all North American territory east of the Mississippi, that came at a staggering price, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The national debt nearly doubled.
Doubled.
Yeah, rocketing from about 75 million to 133 million. That's a colossal sum for the time.
And that massive debt, it really exposed something, didn't it? A difference in perspective.
A fundamental perceptual gap, exactly, between Britain and its colonies. The British government saw their massive spending as, well, protection for the colonies.
Okay.
So it seemed perfectly reasonable to them that the colonists should chip in, contribute to the cost.
But the colonists didn't see it that way.
Not at all. They saw it as an opportunity for expansion. And the restrictions that came after the war felt like a deep betrayal, like denying them rights they'd earned from a victory they helped secure.
So Britain wins this huge war, gains all this territory, but immediately finds itself tangled up in another conflict with Native American nations.
That's right, Pontiac's War in 1763. And General Jeffrey Amherst's policies really didn't help.
How so?
Well, his rather arrogant approach ending diplomatic gift-giving, restricting gunpowder sales, it fueled this pan-Indian resistance. So, to try and prevent another costly war, the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
The proclamation line.
Exactly. Drew a boundary along the Appalachians, designating lands west of it as an Indian reserve. Now, this wasn't just about peacekeeping. It was also a mercantilist move, trying to keep the colonists tied economically to Britain.
Keep them dependent?
Right. Keep them east. Keep them buying British goods.
So how did the colonists, especially those eager for land, react to this king's line? It basically barred them from the land they felt they'd just fought for.
Well, for native nations, it was, at least on paper, an acknowledgement of their land rights.
But for the colonists...
For land-hungry colonists and speculators, it was an outrage. Simple as that. Thousands just ignored it, defied the law, crossed the mountains anyway.
Really? Just went for it?
Yeah. And interestingly, this shared act of defiance against what they saw as imperial interference, it actually bonded colonists from different backgrounds, created a common resentment.
And the native nations involved, they weren't just passive victims in all this, were they? They had their own strategies.
Oh, absolutely not. They were active players. The Cherokee Nation, for instance, used really sophisticated diplomacy, talking about brightening the chain of friendship with the British. And the Iroquois Confederacy, in what you could call a masterful, maybe even cynical move, negotiated the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768.
What did that do?
They strategically ceded lands used primarily by other nations, like the Shawnee and Lenape.
Ah, clever.
Very. It diverted colonial expansion away from their own heartland, satisfied many speculators, but of course it enraged those other native nations. Sowed seeds for future conflict down the line.
Okay, so we've got this massive war debt, these simmering land disputes. Britain needs money. And they turn to the colonies, essentially ending that period of salutary neglect.
Right, exactly. That long-standing, kind of loose enforcement of trade laws. That was over.
So how did they try to get revenue? What was the first big move? The Sugar Act.
The Sugar Act of 1764, yeah. That was a real turning point. because it wasn't just about regulating trade anymore. It was the first act Parliament passed explicitly to raise revenue from the colonies.
Even though it actually lowered the tax on molasses.
Right, but the key was enforcement. They dramatically increased enforcement and introduced these vice admiralty courts. No juries, defendants presumed guilty.
Which colonists saw as stripping away a fundamental right.
Absolutely. And then the Currency Act of 1764 further squeezed the colonial economy. It just added fuel to the fire.
And this is where we really hear that iconic phrase emerge. No taxation without representation. What's the core argument there?
That phrase, James Otis really popularized it. The core argument was simple. Only their own colonial assemblies, where they actually elected representatives, had the right to levy taxes on them.
Makes sense. How did Britain respond to that?
They countered with this idea of virtual representation.
Virtual representation? What does that even mean?
Well, the argument was that Parliament represented all British subjects everywhere, whether they had directly voted for MPs or not.
I can see how the colonists might not buy that.
They didn't. Figures like William Pitt over in Parliament and Daniel Delaney Jr. in Maryland, they basically ridiculed the idea. It created this irreconcilable ideological clash. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about fundamental authority, sovereignty.
Okay, so the Sugar Act tests the waters, creates this ideological clash. Then comes the Stamp Act of 1765. This seems like a major escalation.
Oh, huge. Because it was a direct internal tax. It hit almost everyone.
How so?
It required stamps on all sorts of paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. You couldn't avoid it.
Right, so it touched daily life for nearly everyone.
Exactly. And it provoked this unprecedented, really multi-pronged resistance.
What did that look like?
Well, legislatively, you had things like Patrick Henry's Virginia resolutions, really fiery stuff, and the Stamp Act Congress.
The first time the colonies really acted together.
The first significant joint colonial response, yeah. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting their rights as Englishmen.
And outside the halls of power. In the streets.
That's where the Sons of Liberty came in. They used mobilization, protest, but also intimidation.
Like what?
Hanging effigies of stamp distributors like Andrew Oliver from the Liberty Tree in Boston. They even attacked the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And you saw cooperation between groups, like with merchants Christopher Gadsden down in Charleston.
So this combination, the legislative action and the street pressure, it worked.
It did. The economic pressure from widespread non-importation agreements refusing to buy British goods, combined with the popular violence, it forced Parliament's hand. They repealed the Stamp Act in 1766.
A victory for the colonists.
A victory, yes, but
right.
On the very same day they repealed it, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act.
There's always a catch. What did that say?
It basically asserted Parliament's full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So they backed down on the tax, but doubled down on their right to tax.
Precisely. The immediate crisis was averted, but the fundamental constitutional conflict, still there, left unresolved.
And this whole Stamp Act crisis, it really throws a harsh light on a contradiction within the colonists' own arguments for liberty, doesn't it? Especially concerning slavery.
A deep, painful contradiction, absolutely. You had colonists, many of whom owned enslaved people, passionately arguing that taxation without their consent would reduce them to tributary slaves.
Using the language of slavery to describe their own situation.
Exactly. And enslaved African Americans heard this. They heard the rhetoric of liberty and began applying it to their own condition. You had figures like James Otis, even John Allen, publicly pointing out the hypocrisy. And enslaved people themselves started writing petitions demanding their own freedom based on these same principles.
That's powerful. It also seems like this period really cemented an alliance, maybe an uneasy one, between the elite leaders and the crowds, the mob.
Very much so. You needed both. The elites, like Samuel Adams, provided the constitutional arguments, the frameworks.
That's justification.
Right. But the Sons of Liberty provided the muscle, the physical force on the ground that made the Stamp Act impossible to enforce. This fusion of, high-minded legal theory and raw street power became the template, really, for how the revolution operated moving forward.
Okay, so the Declaratory Act is hanging there, asserting Parliament's authority. They still need money. What's the next attempt to tax the colonies?
That would be the Townshend Acts of 1767. These were different. They were external duties, taxes on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and crucially, tea.
Tea, that sounds familiar.
And a key part of these acts was that the revenue raised was specifically earmarked to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges,
Why was that significant?
because it would make them independent of the colonial assemblies, who previously controlled their salaries through the power of the purse. It was seen as another move to undermine colonial autonomy.
And how did the colonists react to this distinction between external and internal taxes? Did they accept it?
Not really. John Dickinson, in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, just demolished that distinction.
How so?
He argued very persuasively that it didn't matter where the tax was collected, internal or external. What mattered was the intent. If the intent was to raise revenue from the colonists without their consent, it was illegitimate.
So the principle remained the same.
Ex-
Now, with these Townsend Acts and the boycotts that followed, our sources really highlight the role of women. How did they become so central?
Well, it raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? How do you possibly enforce boycotts of imported goods when women are the ones doing most of the household purchasing?
You can't, really. Their participation is essential.
Absolutely crucial. And the Daughters of Liberty were ingenious. They took ordinary domestic activities like spinning yarn and turned them into public political acts.
The spinning bees.
Exactly. They organized spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, a direct substitute for boycotted British textiles. They promoted alternatives to taxed British tea, like Liberty tea, made from local herbs. These weren't just chores anymore. Newspapers reported on them. They became patriotic acts. It demonstrated the huge economic power women held and their willingness to wield it politically.
The Edenton Tea Party in North Carolina is a great example, right? Where women formally signed a pledge.
A fantastic example. October 1774, 51 women signed a resolution publicly supporting the boycott. It showed organized female political action.
Yeah. Okay, so boycotts are happening, tensions are high, especially in Boston where British troops are stationed. This leads us to March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, a really tense situation that just exploded. It started as a small dispute, maybe some taunting, throwing snowballs,
And escalated quickly.
very quickly, into a deadly confrontation between soldiers and a crowd. Crispus Attucks, a sailor, often described as being of mixed African and Native American ancestry, he was the first of 5 colonists killed.
And the Patriot leaders immediately seized on this event, didn't they?
Instantly, Samuel Adams and others labeled it a massacre. Paul Revere produced that incredibly powerful engraving.
The famous one with the soldiers all lined up, firing deliberately.
Right. Highly effective propaganda, though arguably manipulative in its depiction. It showed sneering British soldiers firing volley into a seemingly peaceful, helpless crowd. It inflamed opinion massively.
Yet, in a surprising turn, John Adams, a leading Patriot lawyer, actually defended the soldiers in court? What does that tell us?
It's fascinating, isn't it? His defense reveals this deep tension within the Patriot movement itself. The tension between their ideals of liberty and justice, and sometimes the methods used on the streets. Adams argued for the rule of law, for a fair trial. He argued the soldiers fired in self-defense.
And how did he describe the crowd?
He famously described them as a motley rabble. He specifically mentioned saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktars. He even used Crispus Attucks' race and physical size to suggest the soldiers had reason to be afraid.
Wow, that's complicated.
Extremely. 6 soldiers were acquitted entirely. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, branded on the thumb. It starkly shows how colonial elites could champion liberty in the abstract while simultaneously relying on and perhaps reinforcing deep-seated racial and class prejudices. It raises the question of who exactly the people were that they were fighting for.
While all this is happening in Boston, there's another kind of conflict brewing in the backcountry, isn't there, in North Carolina?
Yes, the Regulator Movement, roughly 1766 to 1771. And this is crucial because it shows the revolution wasn't just coast versus crown. There were deep internal divisions.
What were the regulators fighting against?
They weren't initially fighting the king or parliament. They were fighting their own colonial government, which they saw as corrupt and dominated by a coastal elite. These were mostly small farmers, many Scots, Irish, or German immigrants, protesting unfair taxes, especially the poll tax, and the exorbitant fees charged by local officials appointed by the Eastern establishment.
They felt exploited by their own colonial leaders.
Deeply exploited. And when their petitions and peaceful protests failed,
They escalated.
yes, under leaders like Herman Husband, they started refusing to pay taxes, they disrupted court proceedings. Essentially, they challenged the authority of the colonial government.
How did the colonial government respond?
Royal Governor William Tryon mustered the colonial militia composed largely of those same Eastern elites the regulators were protesting against and marched west. They met the regulators at the Battle of Alamance in 1771 and decisively crushed the rebellion. Several regulator leaders were hanged.
That must have left incredible bitterness.
Lasting bitterness. And here's the key insight. Many of those former regulators later became loyalists during the Revolution.
Not because they loved the king.
Not necessarily, but because they hated the North Carolina Patriot leadership, the very people who had defeated them at Alamance even more. It drives home the point that in many areas, the American Revolution was effectively a civil war, fought over local power, class resentments, regional tensions, as much as it was about independence from Britain.
Those internal divisions are so important to remember. Okay, let's jump forward a bit. The Boston Tea Party in 1773. Parliament reacts forcefully with what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts in 1774. What were these?
They were officially the coercive acts, and they were punitive, aimed squarely at Massachusetts to punish it for the Tea Party.
What did they do specifically?
They closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. They essentially annulled the Massachusetts colonial charter, restricting town meetings. They allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, not the colonies.
Taking away self-government and legal recourse.
Exactly. And then the Quebec Act, passed around the same time, added to the alarm. It extended Quebec's boundaries south into territory claimed by other colonies, and it granted religious tolerance to Catholics.
Which didn't sit well with the largely Protestant colonies.
No, it fueled fears of popery and arbitrary government. The overall goal of the coercive acts was clear: isolate Massachusetts, make an example of it, and break the resistance.
But that's not what happened, is it? It seems to have had the opposite effect.
Completely backfired. Instead of isolating Boston, it united the colonies in sympathy and outrage.
How did they respond?
Food and supplies poured into Boston from other colonies, showing solidarity. And crucially, the committees of correspondence, these intercolonial networks, kicked into high gear. They coordinated a unified response, which led directly to the calling of the First Continental Congress.
Philadelphia, September 1774. What was the mood there? Was everyone ready for a fight?
Not necessarily. The Congress faced a tough balancing act. There were deep divisions. You had conservatives like Joseph Galloway from Pennsylvania. He actually proposed a plan of union, a kind of compromise involving a new American legislature that would work with Parliament.
But that didn't pass.
It was narrowly defeated. The more radical faction gained momentum, especially when Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves from Massachusetts.
What did those call for?
They were quite radical, calling for Massachusetts to basically ignore the coercive acts, form its own independent government, withhold taxes, and arm a militia.
Wow. So Congress endorses that.
They did. It was a significant step. Ultimately, the Congress issued a Declaration of Resolves, which listed colonial grievances and asserted their rights. They sent petitions to the king, still hoping for reconciliation.
But they also did something else, something more concrete.
Yes, and this was hugely important. They created the Continental Association.
The Continental Association, what was that? It sounds like more than just a statement.
Much more. Established in October 1774, it was basically a blueprint for economic warfare against Britain. It called for a comprehensive non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement.
So stop buying British goods, stop using them, and eventually stop selling colonial goods to Britain.
Exactly. It banned British goods,
Yeah.
including, significantly, the importation of enslaved people. And it threatened export bans if Britain didn't address their grievances. It also called for austerity, promoting frugality, discouraging gambling, even fancy funerals.
A real attempt to exert collective economic power. How was it enforced? That seems like the tricky part.
That's where its real political power lay. The association called for the election of committees of inspection in every county, city, and town.
Local committees?
Yes. And these committees essentially became de facto local governments. They monitored merchants, checked imports, pressured neighbors to comply. Anyone found violating the boycott could be publicly named and shamed as an enemy of American liberty. It was powerful social and economic coercion.
And again, women must have been absolutely key to making this work on the ground.
Indispensable. Since they managed household consumption, their commitment to non-consumption and finding alternatives was essential for the association's success. That Edenton Tea Party pledge we mentioned fits right into this context, women actively enforcing the boycott.
So the association really forces people to choose sides. The middle ground is disappearing fast. This isn't a unified movement, is it? It's becoming a civil war.
It really is. And we need to talk about the Loyalists. It's easy to forget them, but they were a significant portion of the population.
How many? And who were they?
Estimates vary, but maybe up to a third of the white colonial population had loyalist sympathies at some point. It was a diverse group. Sure, you had wealthy elites, royal officials, Anglican clergy who were tied to the crown, merchants who feared economic disruption. But loyalism was also strong among some minority groups who felt protected by the crown, tenant farmers who resented their patriot landlords, recent immigrants, and as we discussed, those former North Carolina regulators.
So not just the rich elite.
Not at all. And pacifist groups like the Quakers tried to stay neutral, but the pressure from patriots to take loyalty oaths often pushed them towards the loyalist side, or at least made them suspect.
And it's interesting, some of these people who ended up as loyalists had actually supported the earlier protests against things like the Stamp Act.
That's a crucial point. People like Joseph Galloway, who proposed that plan of union. They were critics of British policy, but they wanted reform within the empire. They saw the escalating radicalism of the committees of inspection, the militias, as dangerous steps towards mob rule and anarchy. They feared losing their property and their connection to Britain.
And as patriots gained more local control through these committees, what happened to suspected loyalists?
They faced increasing pressure and persecution, public humiliation, boycotts of their businesses, confiscation of property, demands for loyalty oaths. And violence, tarring, and feathering wasn't uncommon. Many were forced to flee, becoming refugees, or eventually took up arms for the British.
So the lines are drawn. By spring 1775, Massachusetts is effectively in open rebellion, stockpiling weapons. General Gage in Boston knows this. What does he do?
He gets orders to act decisively. On the night of April 18, 1775, he sends about 700 British regulars out from Boston towards Concord.
Their mission?
To seize colonial military supplies, gunpowder, cannons reportedly stored there, and possibly arrest key Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, thought to be in the area.
But the Patriots knew they were coming.
Yes, the colonial intelligence network was surprisingly effective. Writers like Paul Revere and William Dawes set out to warn the militia and the leaders the regulars are out.
Which leads us to Lexington Green early morning, April 19th.
Right. A small company of local militiamen, maybe 70 or 80, assembled on the green as the British column marched through. They were ordered to disperse. Then a shot rang out.
The famous shot heard round the world. Do we know who fired it?
Still debated to this day. Could have been a colonial spectator, a nervous militiaman, a jumpy British soldier. We simply don't know for sure. But that shot led to a volley from the British troops. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead or dying.
The first casualties of the war?
Yes. The British then continued to Concord, found some supplies, but most had been moved, had another skirmish at the North Bridge where they took casualties.
And then they had to march back to Boston.
And that retreat turned into a nightmare for them. A 16-mile running battle.
How so?
Thousands of militiamen from surrounding towns had mobilized. They gathered along the road, firing from behind stone walls, trees, houses, sniping at the retreating British column all the way back.
Heavy casualties for the British.
Significant. Nearly 300 killed, wounded, or missing by the time they staggered back into Boston under the protection of British warships. The colonists suffered losses too, but far fewer. The war had begun. And immediately, a propaganda war started too. Both sides blaming the other for firing first at Lexington. It cemented the shift from political argument to armed conflict.
So Lexington and Concord happen. Just weeks later, the Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia, May 1775. They're now facing an active war. Surely independence is the goal now.
You'd think so, but incredibly, no, not yet. That's the paradox.
They're raising an army, fighting British soldiers, but still not aiming for independence. How does that work?
It highlights just how deeply divided the delegates still were and how strong the emotional and political ties to Britain remained for many. They took actions necessary for defense. They created the Continental Army, appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. That was huge.
But politically?
Politically, the moderate faction, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still held considerable sway. They pushed for one last attempt at reconciliation.
Which was?
The Olive Branch Petition, sent to King George III in July 1775.
An olive branch, while they're fighting his troops.
Exactly. It professed continued loyalty to the king personally and blamed the conflict on his artful and cruel ministers in Parliament. They pleaded with him to intervene and find a peaceful resolution.
It sounds almost contradictory.
It was. And just to show how contradictory, the very next day after adopting the Olive Branch Petition,
Yes.
Congress adopted the Declaration of the Causes and necessity of taking up arms.
A completely different tone.
Much harder line. co-authored by Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson. It listed grievances, justified armed resistance, and declared famously that the colonists were resolved to die free men rather than to live as slaves.
So sending two completely opposing messages almost simultaneously.
Essentially, yes, trying to keep both the moderates and the more radical factions on board.
And how did the king react to the olive branch petition?
He refused even to receive it. And in August 1775, he issued his own proclamation of rebellion, declaring the colonies to be in open revolt and calling on loyal subjects to help suppress it.
So that effectively slammed the door shut.
Completely.
Yeah.
It shattered any lingering fiction that the fight was just with Parliament, not the king himself. It made reconciliation seem impossible and pushed many moderates towards the independence camp.
Okay, the path to reconciliation is closed. The war is escalating. But there's still a big psychological hurdle to clear for many colonists actually wanting independence. What finally tips the balance?
That happens in January 1776, with a little 46-page pamphlet that became an absolute publishing phenomenon, Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Common Sense. Even the title is direct. What made it so incredibly impactful?
Several things. First, the sheer scale. It sold maybe 120,000 copies in just a few months. Adjusted for population, that's like something reaching the viewership of a modern Super Bowl.
Wow. Unprecedented readership.
Totally. But it was also the style. Paine wrote in clear, forceful, sometimes angry common language. Not complex legal arguments. He spoke directly to the average person.
And what was his message?
No more mincing words. He attacked King George III directly, calling him the royal brute of England.
He didn't hold back.
Not at all. He demolished the reverence many colonists still held for the British Constitution and the institution of monarchy itself. He famously wrote, "Of more worth is one honest man to society than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived."
Strong stuff.
He ridiculed the idea of Britain as the mother country, arguing it was absurd for a continent to be governed by an island. He insisted reconciliation was a fallacious dream.
Yeah.
And crucially, he framed independence not just as necessary, but as a historic opportunity. A chance for America to begin the world all over again, to create a new kind of republic based on liberty.
So what was the overall effect of Common Sense?
It was electrifying. It galvanized public opinion in favor of independence like nothing else had. It took the arguments out of Congress and into the taverns and onto the streets. It shifted the terms of the debate and put immense pressure on the delegates in Philadelphia. It basically severed those last remaining emotional and ideological ties to Britain for a huge number of people, made independence seem not just possible, but logical and urgent.
With public opinion swinging decisively thanks to Paine, the momentum in Congress builds. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduces his resolution for independence on June 7, 1776.
That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A momentous step.
And Congress appoints a committee to draft a formal declaration, just in case Lee's resolution passes, the Committee of Five.
Right. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson.
And Jefferson gets the main writing job? Why him?
Apparently, he was known for his writing skill, his peculiar felicity of expression, as Adams later put it. Adams also knew Jefferson was from Virginia, the most powerful colony, which would add weight. Jefferson produced the initial draft, drawing heavily on Enlightenment ideas, especially John Locke's theories of natural rights.
Life, liberty, and property.
Locke's phrase, yes. Jefferson famously adapted it. He also drew on George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had just been adopted. Mason used life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety.
And Jefferson crafts that into the preamble.
The iconic preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just incredible words.
Truly timeless. But the document Congress finally adopted on July 4th wasn't exactly Jefferson's first draft, was it? Congress made changes.
Significant changes. They debated it intensely for several days, line by line. They tweaked phrasing, tightened arguments.
And made one major deletion.
Yes, a really significant one. Jefferson had included a long, passionate passage condemning the transatlantic slave trade.
He condemned the slave trade.
He did, blaming King George III for forcing it on the colonies and waging cruel war against human nature itself. It's a complex passage, given Jefferson himself enslaved hundreds of people.
So why was it removed?
Primarily to secure unanimous support for independence. Delegates from South Carolina and Georgia were absolutely opposed to ending the slave trade. Their economies depended on it.
And some northern delegates.
Some northern delegates were also uncomfortable, as merchants in their colonies had profited significantly from the trade they'd been, as Jefferson put it, pretty considerable carriers of enslaved people. So for the sake of unity, the passage was struck out.
A profound compromise or maybe contradiction right at the founding moment.
A profound contradiction. The Declaration proclaims liberty while simultaneously silencing a critique of the very institution that denied liberty to hundreds of thousands.
And the final document, formally adopted July 4th, signed by most delegates later on August 2nd. That was a dangerous act.
An act of treason. By signing, they were putting everything on the line, pledging, as the closing line says, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It was incredibly courageous.
So the Declaration is adopted, a huge moment, but its reception, its meaning on the ground, it wasn't uniform, was it?
Not at all. Its reception was incredibly varied, depending on who you were and where you stood.
For the patriots.
For patriots, it was a moment of celebration, justification, and unity. Bells rang, bonfires were lit. In New York City, a crowd famously pulled down a lead statue of King George III.
To melt into musket balls, right?
Legend says 42,000 musket balls, yeah. It solidified the patriot cause, turned rebels into citizens of new states, and crucially, it opened the door for foreign alliances. Declaring independence meant they could now formally seek help from France and Spain as a sovereign nation.
But for others, it was a very different story. For loyalists,
It was the final betrayal. It confirmed their worst fears of illegal rebellion and anarchy. It marked them definitively as enemies of the new states, leading to increased persecution, property confiscation, violence, and ultimately exile for tens of thousands. It was a disaster.
And for Native American nations, the Declaration has some harsh words for them.
Extremely harsh. It refers to them as merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Just awful.
So it signaled danger for them.
Clearly. Most Native nations saw the land-hungry Americans, now unleashed from British restraint, as the far greater threat to their lands and sovereignty. That's why the majority allied themselves with the British during the war. The American victory would prove catastrophic for them.
And for enslaved African Americans, those words, all men are created equal, what did they mean in practice?
That's the central paradox, isn't it? The words themselves became an incredibly powerful tool against slavery. Abolitionists seized on them immediately. Enslaved people themselves used that language in petitions for freedom.
So it inspired hope and action.
Definitely. And opportunities arose. Lord Dunmore's proclamation offering freedom to slaves who joined the British, Washington eventually allowing black soldiers in the Continental Army. But the revolution itself did not end slavery.
In fact, in the South.
In the South, arguably, the commitment to slavery became even more entrenched after the Revolution, defended now in the name of property rights, another key revolutionary ideal. So the contradiction wasn't resolved, it deepened, setting the stage for future conflict.
Even way out on the frontiers, the war and this declaration had ripples, sometimes in unexpected places. You mentioned Arkansas Post.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little footnote. Arkansas Post was this small, strategically important outpost on the Mississippi, controlled by Spain, who eventually allied with the Americans. It served as a vital supply link for the American cause in the West. And it was actually the site of the only Revolutionary War battle fought in what's now Arkansas.
When was that?
Get this, April 1783. Months after the preliminary peace treaty between Britain and the U.S. had already been signed in Paris.
Wow. News traveled slow.
Incredibly slow. It highlights the vast distances involved, the complex, multi-ethnic nature of the war on the frontier, involving British partisans, Spanish soldiers, American allies, local settlers, native groups. It was messy. So if we try to connect all these threads, looking back from the 7 Years' War through the protests, the violence, the debates in Philadelphia, the story of American independence is just so much more complex, right, than the simple heroic narrative we sometimes get.
Much more complex, not a single triumphant story.
No, it was chaotic, it was often incredibly violent, and it was deeply, deeply contested. You had all these different groups, patriot elites, backcountry farmers, enslaved people, native nations, loyalists, women, all with vastly different goals, different fears, and very different ideas about what liberty actually meant and for whom.
So the independence declared on July 4th, 1776, it wasn't really the end of the story. It wasn't a finished product. It feels more like an unfinished promise.
That's a perfect way to put it, an unfinished promise. Those critical years, those 14 hours of independence, as one historian called them, they didn't resolve the fundamental questions that were raised.
Questions like?
Like, who is actually included in We the People? What does all men are created equal truly mean in practice, especially when faced with slavery and the exclusion of women and Native Americans? How can a republic founded on ideals of liberty tolerate chattel slavery? How can a nation built on the rule of law emerge from mob action, boycotts, and outright rebellion?
These questions weren't settled in 1776.
Not even close. And they remain, in many ways, right at the heart of American identity, the core of our ongoing national conversation, even today.
It's not just history then. It feels like it's embedded in the very DNA of the country.
I think so. And maybe that leads us to a final thought, a question for you, the listener, to ponder. If freedom isn't some static thing we inherit, but rather a dynamic, maybe even a perpetual struggle, what responsibility does that place on each generation? What responsibility do we have to continue that work of, forming a more perfect union, of wrestling with those contradictions and trying to extend that promise of liberty to everyone, a promise that for many is still very much in the process of becoming free?